label.
Yeah.
Even though we'll just wait a minute or two before we get to your presentation and Rachel's interview of you, I'd like to take a moment, if it's okay with you, just to introduce the topic and why this is special meaning for me on the eve of Shavuot. First of all, I know that today is Mother's Day, and for many people, that's a very emotional day, very emotional. And a lot of people just have also family obligations at this time. But having had the privilege to discuss this book with my dear friend who I admire so much as a teacher, Dr. Leon Kass, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful expression of our love for mothers to take time out on this Mother's Day and learn about two of the great examples of mothers in our biblical history, Naomi and Ruth, especially on the eve of Shavuot. This is a book that is a beautiful, beautiful interpretation of the book of Ruth, an interpretation that will really set the standard for how somebody has to read this book. And I'm sure it will inspire many, many comments on it and many people taking it and going with it in different directions. But ultimately, it's a beautiful, beautiful story that's told by Dr. Kass, which he studied with his granddaughter. And I'm sure our dear friend Rachel is taking time out on her day to interview Dr. Kass. We'll get into that as well. So thank you so much again for giving us your time from the holy city of Jerusalem to teach us Torah. Ki mitzion teitze Torah. For from Zion, Torah shall go forth. We are here, we are your students, and we are eager to learn at your feet. Thank you so, so much. And I hand it off to my dear friend, Rachel Wildavsky, to conduct this session.
Thank you, Shmuel. And, it's really a pleasure to be here and to be Zooming to Jerusalem on the eve of this beautiful holiday. What could be better? And Leon, it's wonderful to talk about your book. For those of you who have not seen it, it's called Reading Ruth, Birth, Redemption, and the Way of Israel. And Leon, this book is readable and brief and very deep. And those are three things that almost never go together. So congratulations on having written it. And the congratulations go to you and your granddaughter. But let's start there. I'd like to see if you don't mind taking just a minute to tell us how this project was conceived, this project of Reading Ruth.
Well, it wasn't intended to be a book in the first place. This began in the sad months after Amy passed away in the fall of 2015. And my granddaughter, Hannah, who has a very old neshama and who was then 16 years old, said to me, Zeta, maybe you'd like to read something with me. And I just leapt at this opportunity. And I'll tell you in a moment why we chose Ruth. But 2 or 3 times a week on FaceTime for about 2.5 months from mid-October through the end of December, we read Ruth aloud, a couple psukim at a time, and just paused to ask the basic questions. What's it say? What's going on here? What's going on with the characters? What's the underlying thought? And we chose Ruth because Amy and I had made a discovery, some 20, 25 years ago that we thought was the key to understanding the whole story. And we said we'd return to it and work on it sometime. And that never happened. And I, of course, forgot what the insight was. And so I thought maybe studying with Hannah, we could recover it. And I was really hoping that we could do that. And sure enough, in the first or second session, Hannah found it. And I began to take notes. And to make a long story short, I sort of took notes on all of the conversations. And at the end, decided I'd write it up to see what, if anything, it amounted to. And it took a long time to go from those notes to a finished book. Hannah was in the Air Force and so on. Went through many drafts, but it is, for obvious reasons, in addition to the things I've done with Amy, the most meaningful professional activity of my life. I'm just so thrilled that Hannah joined me in producing this. She's camera shy. She was supposed to do this, but she just doesn't like the prominence. So she sent me forth on my own, but she deserves an awful lot of the credit for what's in here.
Well, the two of you achieved a lot. So let's dive in. It's great to know how, I think it adds a layer of meaning to the book to know that it began under these auspices. So thanks for making that part of the story, part of the book. Maybe to much of the Bible, to sort of dive into what this is all about, much of the Bible and of the books in our canon are about great events, affairs of state, terrible people, marvelous events. And this book of Ruth, you and Hannah describe as a modest domestic tale of woe and redemption. So what's it really about? Is it such a modest tale in the end?
Well, it is by comparison a modest tale, but not for that reason unimportant. In fact, you could say on the contrary, all of those struggles and the nastiness was in the service of a kind of teaching which could lead to the sanctification of everyday life, in which ordinary affairs of human life would not be dull and merely prosaic, but they would be the occasion for the expression of the higher calling to live a life of righteousness and holiness. And if you ask yourself, what is this book really about? It's actually about a lot of very important things in Israel. Although it's basically a domestic tale, the frame of the story is in fact political. It begins in the days of the judging of the judges, when there is also famine in the land, and it finishes with the birth of Israel's greatest king, King David, whose name is the last word of the book, and he is the descendant of this marriage which miraculously takes place in this book between Ruth and Boaz. Ruth is one of two books of the Tanakh that's named for a woman, and it's the only book that's named for an outsider. Ruth is a Moabite, a woman of not only of an alien, but also of an enemy, indeed the arch enemy nation, a member of which should never find a home in Israel. So it's also about the relation between Israel and the outsiders. And centrally, it's about the theme of, on the one hand, friendship, on the other hand, marital love and generation. And in connection with that, it's about the relation of families to the land. To make a long story short, what you get in this story is a certain celebration both of the redemptive power of marriage and procreation and the redemption of the land, so individuals are not lost without a trace, and no family is alienated from its portion of the promised land. But these are very large themes indeed, the story doesn't preach about them, but shines light on it through this extraordinary, delicate, but nevertheless insistent and powerful tale.
That's such a great place for us to start. You and Hannah find a lot of the story, the key elements of the story to take place in a series of conversations. So maybe let's sort of get down to brass tacks now and start with one of the most famous conversations in the book of Ruth, and that is the one consisting of Ruth's great speech, justifiably famous, to her mother-in-law Naomi, and Naomi's interesting response. So would you tell us a little bit about what you find in that conversation?
Yeah, well, I need one thing before that, Rachel,
Sure.
and you've been very patient in not asking what is this great rediscovered fact in the story.
That was going to be my last question, Leon, because you never identify it.
Can I do it now? Because
yes, please.
It will shine light. It will shine light really on this first conversation. Mm-hmm. The family Elimelech, Naomi, and the two sons during the famine go to Moab. Of all the places to go, they go there. Elimelech dies. Not told why. His two sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. They live there for 10 years. Both sons die. And the text says, for the second time, Naomi was left alone. And Hannah says to me, there are 10 years in Moab. There are two marriages for 10 years, and there are no grandchildren. Where are the grandchildren? And what you see is Moab is a place not only of death, but of no generation. It's sterile. There's no life of Israel in Moab. And indeed, it's the antithesis of the Israelite way. So you have in the background highlighted the absence of children, the importance of children for a way of life which depends upon the transmission from one generation to the next, but hearkening back to the original Brit with Abraham. So you then have this great speech where Naomi decides to go back. She's heard the famine is over, and she tells her daughters-in-law, return to your homes. It's the only place that you will find new husbands. And what's on Naomi's mind is the remarriage of her daughters-in-law, but both daughters-in-law want to travel with her. She finally persuades Orpah to return, but Ruth makes a speech to Naomi, which is stunning and beautiful and glorious. And it moves us to tears to hear it, except that if you look carefully, it's a speech that this daughter-in-law, in Hebrew, Kalah, it's the kind of speech that a bride, also Kalah, would make to her groom down to the until death do us part. Ruth makes a speech of undying friendship, of cleaving to her mother-in-law, right? And it's beautiful for an expression of chesed to the living and also to the dead husband and lost son to Naomi. But this speech takes place only in the first part of the book. And to my great astonishment, you'd think that when she was finished, Naomi would at least say, thank you very much. But it says, when she couldn't persuade her, Naomi kept silent, and the two of them walked all the way to Bethlehem. And I want to say, in silence. Naomi accepts Ruth's speech not because she's persuaded of its rightfulness, but out of resignation. And Naomi is still in her heart of hearts a patron of marriage and children, not of this devoted female friendship. And she will keep silent, but she will never let it out of her mind to find a way to get Ruth remarried, an option that she thinks is almost impossible back in Bethlehem, because Ruth is a Moabite from the despised and excluded nation.
That's so different from the reading of that speech that we often hear, but you definitely support it with the language in the text. So,
yeah, look, I mean, I don't want to minimize this speech. I mean, it's the first we hear of her,
mm-hmm.
and she's a creature just of. I mean, her main virtue, celebrated by everybody in the book, is chesed, the virtue of loyal devotion, of gracious kindness. And it, in fact, is absolutely central to the motion of the book. But the principle that she enunciated there is in a speech that the author has written for her, glorious though it is not the final teaching of the book. It's a vehicle to the final teaching of the book, but the final teaching of the book is somehow found in her marriage to Boaz and in the birth of a child.
Well, let's move to the next great conversation that we might focus on and see if we can get to that. Next conversation let's talk about would be Boaz's speech with Ruth on the field where she is gleaning. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that conversation to the story?
Well, this is Act 2, And this takes place, I mean, Act 2 introduces us they've come back, Naomi and Ruth have come back impoverished. The women of the village, there's no kindness. If Ruth is a creature of chesed, chesed is dead in Bethlehem, at least to these returning people, perhaps because there's a Moabite present, who knows? But the text introduces us and says, Naomi had a kinsman, a relative of her husband, Boaz, an Ish Gibor Chayil. He's a big man in town. And you think we're going to find out something about what nice thing he's going to do for them, but nothing. And it takes Ruth's gesture to saying, maybe Naomi, I should go out and glean for us. Maybe I'll find favor in some field. After all, we're needy. And Naomi says, go, my daughter. She pronounces blessings on her. She doesn't tell Ruth that she has a rich relative in town. She doesn't want to prejudice her. She doesn't want to raise expectations. She'll be grateful for the food, but I think secretly Naomi has in mind, maybe something will happen here. Something shared will happen. And they go out, and Ruth is gleaning in the field. She just happens onto the field that just happens to belong to Boaz, who just happens. Hine Boaz shows up on the field, and immediately he notices this woman, and he asks the overseer, who's that woman? And he gets a little information, and he strikes up a conversation with her full of grace, telling her, my daughter, do not go anywhere else. Follow the women in this field and glean only here. Do not go anywhere else. And if you're thirsty, you can drink of the water that the young men will have drawn for you. I've already told them, although we don't hear him, he's telling them right now to the young men, leave her alone, be kind to her, don't bother her, don't make any advances. Ruth is absolutely flabbergasted. She falls down on the ground. Her face is covered so that no one will see her embarrassment at this kind of solicitude. But she's no wallflower. She says to him, what is it that I've done to deserve this? I'm a foreign woman. I'm a Moabite woman. Are you sure you're not making a mistake treating me with this kindness? In fact, the first word out of Ruth's mouth to Boaz is Madua. Why? She wants to understand the situation, and she's in a way putting him to the test.
It's a challenging question, isn't it, in a way? She's not a shrinking violet.
Yeah, and he doesn't disappoint. He says, the reason I'm doing this actually is I've heard all about you. I've heard of the chesed that you practice to the living and the dead. So be assured, you're more or less welcomed. Your reputation has preceded you. And he basically says, the fact that you're a Moabite is of no account because your merit, not your origin, entitles you to this kind of courtesy. And she responds by saying, you have spoken to my heart. And she goes off to glean. The next thing is he's not done with her. They come in for a meal. She's sitting somewhat bashfully afar off. She summons her over to sit next to him, invites her to dip into the vinegar her morsel of bread, and basically welcomes her into this community through a shared meal. And then she goes off to glean. And once she's gone, he tells the men workers, don't embarrass her. Let her glean as long as she wants. And by the way, take out some stuff from the already gathered stuff and leave it on the ground for her. It's an extraordinary excess of hospitality. And one can't help but think that he is somehow smitten with her. We're not told anything about how she looks, but we know from how she speaks, there's somebody really special here.
Well, he sees also, as you just said, merit in her. Is there other, and you said it's her merit and not her origin that drives this scene, the specific merit that she has being Chesed. But is there another place in the canon of the Jews where Chesed is a driver, and where you see this distinction between merit and I think it's more the latter that I'm asking about, where you see this distinction that's not who you, where you're from or what people you're a part of, but your personal merit. Does that come up elsewhere?
If this is a quiz, I've lost my wits. Help me.
Anybody? I'm not thinking, I'm not aware of one that this is not a quiz. I just wondered if it struck me just now when you said it doesn't matter that she's a Moabite, it's her individual human merit.
Well, look,
does that come up anywhere else in the Bible?
Maybe the rabbi or the Maharat can help, but I think it's in the local place.
Mm-hmm.
In the local place, look, I mean, Chesed is, and I had it in mind, but I didn't review it. It doesn't appear that often. It appears, of course, in the 13 Midot of Hashem, when Moshe gets this partial revelation, Rav Chesed ve'emet. But it's mentioned also in various places in Breshit, and I've just lost it. I went to the concordance and I found the number of places where it's ascribed. But here the important thing is, and the important thing, we've been talking mostly about the woman and the family and the childbirth, but there's also the important thing. This is a family that went to Moab and brought home someone who's treif in this community. A Moabite shall never enter the community. And she has been, with Naomi, ostracized in this community. This is the first venturing forth, and she puts her foreignness in right between his eyes. So the question is, here is a moment, a test for Boaz. Will he only see the foreignness that she insists that he notice, or is he able, in fact, to transcend that fact and see that there is a kind of merit, a certain kind of godly merit? And he says, I've heard about it. I've heard about how you've practiced it. And by the way, he says to her here, a very important line for later, he calls down God's blessing on her. May he spread his wing over you, despite the fact that you're a Moabite and a foreigner, because you've somehow earned it. You have practiced a kind of divine chesed to the living and the dead, meaning to Naomi and to your dead husband. And may Hashem spread his wing over you.
This takes us, Leon, I'm moving us ahead to the next conversation because it's too tempting not to, because this spreading of the wing appears in one of the next great conversations. We're skipping a lot, everybody, but I'm assuming you read the book. One of the next great conversations is a famous scene on the threshing floor. This metaphor comes up again. So let's just for now jump ahead to that and tell us about that conversation. Set it up.
Yeah, we got to set it up.
Yeah.
Act 3, Act 2 finishes. Ruth comes back from the gleaning field with 36 bushels of barley flour gleaned in the field, and she returns to Naomi, and she reveals. Naomi asks, where were you, my dear? Oh, I gleaned in the field of Boaz. And at that mention, Naomi's heart skips a beat. She sees maybe providence is working, maybe there's a possibility. And she's waiting and waiting. Boaz is obviously, Ruth has told her the whole story, And after she hears this story, she thinks Boaz will arrive for tea tomorrow. There'll be some follow-up and garnished. It goes to the very end of the harvest. And Naomi understands this is going to be the last opportunity for anything to happen between them till next year. So she makes a speech to Ruth first. This is her answer to Ruth's great speech. Mm-hmm. She now tells her, this is what she's telling her to do. She says, this Boaz in whose field you were in, he's actually a kinsman redeemer of ours. He's a Goel. Silence from Ruth. You should, let me see, I've lost something from this, but you should bathe and anoint yourself. Oh, sorry, tonight, he is, at the end of the harvest, there's going to be a celebration to celebrate the end of the harvest. Naomi, you see, has got her ear to the ground. She knows what's going on. Bathe, anoint yourself, go down there, and after he's eaten and drink, lie down at his feet, and he'll tell you what to do. And it sounds for all the world that she's counseling seduction. The reader who knows the origin of Moab will know that the original Moab is the child of an incestuous liaison between Lot's daughter and Lot, who made Lot drunk after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, thinking that she and her sister were the last people alive and they had to father children. So looks like Naomi is counseling Ruth to play Lot's daughter to a sated, if not drunken, Boaz. It turns out the story is a foil for what actually happens. Ruth arrives, lies down. The scene is that she has to take the initiative. She has to lie with Boaz, but Boaz has to rise to the occasion and see what's on offer here. And he wakes in the middle of the night and he says to her, "Who are you?" And she says, for the first time in the whole book, announcing her name, "I am Ruth, your handmaiden. Spread your wing over me," etc., repeating to him these words as before. And in these 10 words, she somehow inspires him to recognize the circumstance before him and says to her, "You have shown more chesed tonight, choosing me rather than the young men than you have shown before. I will do as you have asked," meaning I will marry you, "but we have a problem. There's someone who is in line ahead of me. Spend the night here, go home before sunrise. I'll take care of it in the morning." And what I think is gorgeous here is Boaz, I think, was taken with her. But he didn't want to force an old man's attention on a young woman, or he was fearful that she would reject him. And there was this other relative who had first obligation and who had to waive that right of redemption of the missing land and of the widow Ruth. And for all these reasons, I think he was standoffish until she comes during this night and chastely sends him the message, "I have chosen you for me." And it's one of these fiddle around the roof moments. I mean, miracle of miracles, she has chosen me. And he immediately sees what to do. He does not take advantage of her as his ancestor Judah took of Tamar, whose descendant he himself is. So, I mean, Ruth again makes the kind of speech which enables him to see the full meaning of who she is and her offer, and summons him not to a one-night stand, but to a marriage.
It's wonderful because it's when you think about levirate marriage now, you can see how a modern woman might find it offensive because you have men arranging her destiny above her, over her head. If she's married to a man who dies, it is decided for her, we think, that she should marry his brother. But in this case, you see a levirate marriage and Ruth instigates it. And it's also, you think of the levirate marriage as being primarily about keeping the land in the family, which I have some more questions about that, which I will want to ask you in a moment. But it's about the land as much as it is about the child, or seems to be. And here you have what really looks like a love match, and it's kind of it's set up. The levirate marriage provides the structure for this love match to happen, but this is two people coming together with love or the beginnings of it. They're certainly by choice. So it's a kind of different from what we would usually think about when we think of levirate marriage.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting because the conjunction, there are two things that are combined here. First, there is I think it's in Vayikra, there is the teaching about the redemption of lost land. Mm-hmm. If someone is poor and has to sell his land, there are relatives who are under obligation to redeem the land, to perform geula, redemption of the land. Mm-hmm. And that falls on any relative to restore the land. And if there isn't someone to do that, the land would revert during the Jubilee. Mm. Okay. A very important thing, that there should not be a permanent division in Israel between the landed and the unlanded, and every family has a share in the promised land in perpetuity. Very important. But the teaching about about Ibum and the levirate marriage is in Dvarim, and it's separate. Mm. And there the obligation falls only on brothers. I mean, we had a story in Breshit before the law was passed, with Judah who marries a Canaanite woman, an Adullamite woman, and he has his first son for whom he provides the wife Tamar. The first son, his name I've just forgotten, is sinful and is killed. Then the second son is supposed to perform Ibum, but he takes the pleasure of Tamar, spills his seed, and he's killed. And Judah withholds the third son because he's afraid that this is an unlucky match. And Tamar, dressed as a harlot, gets him to perform Ibum himself. And Boaz is, in fact, the seventh generation child of Perez, who's one of the sons of this. So, but that horrible arrangement is then regulated in Dvarim. That union is forbidden in Vayikra, but the brother has an obligation to marry the widow of his brother and to raise up a child that will be his brother's child, will bear the name of the brother, so that that brother will not disappear from Israel. And that same language is used here. What's unique is Boaz unites these two things together. He anticipates what the rabbis will later do. That junction is not in the Torah. That's much later, but Boaz anticipates it, that what you want is both that the dead shall not disappear without a trace, and that the family shall not be alienated from the land, and you will raise up seed to the dead son upon his own inherited land. Boaz sort of legislates for the community as somehow inspired by this offer. By the way, she doesn't say you are going to do Ibum. She says you are our Goel. You are the redeemer of our land. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who has put two and two together, because this offer of the land comes with the offer of the woman for whom he has certainly deep affection. There's a very fine book by Yael Ziegler who argues that this is all done from duty and love has no part of it. But I don't think that's right. I mean, just because there's no swooning and panting and neither of them wear their heart on their sleeves doesn't mean that this isn't a kind of deep affection born of the profound admiration of the neshama and of the grace of these two extraordinary people.
Right, who are both adults. And this is a very adult marriage, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
A couple of things here, if we can break into the flow for a moment. We are a small group, so let's take advantage of that. If anybody has a question, why don't you type it in the chat? And we'll see if we can, Leanne, assuming you're okay with this, we'll see if we can reserve time for you to take a question or two. But
sure.
I'm still holding on to the questions here because I have a couple more for you. So I don't want to spend all of our time on land, although I'm already feeling like we could do so much with this. But let's talk just for a moment, one more question about it. You write, you and your co-author write that this institution of the levirate marriage has something to do with the status of land in the promised land, that property is, I'm trying to find the quote that I took from you, land is not interchangeable. It's just, what's the phrase you use? Not free-floating real estate, that each family is attached to a specific piece of land and that specific attachment can't be violated, can't be lost. So if that's the case, then does this system of marriage have anything to teach us today? Because for us, land really is free-floating real estate. I mean, unless you're a landed aristocrat in Europe. But so what can we learn from this now? And what is, I'm going to make the question a little bit broader. It's a truism that in the past, marriage was really a matter of property, and that it's a modern idea that marriage should be a matter of love. Many people believe this to be true. But I guess the bigger question is, what is the role of property in marriage? And is that still important today? So specifically land and the greater question, property.
Yeah, look, I want to rescue the suggestion that the biblical account of marriage is primarily, like in other places, about property. It's about generation.
Okay.
And it's about generation, not just of life, but of a way of life. When one moves from the family principle as somehow embodied in the covenantal obligation of circumcision, in which children are not somehow celebrated for what will be their male prowess, but in remembrance of the covenant that Avraham and God made together to be a nation that taught righteousness in the world. When that principle is elevated to the national principle, the family principle isn't forgotten. What's added to it is a concern really for the community. And the community is a community that's to inhabit a land, family by family, equally each with an equal share and a stake in this land. They all are shareholders somehow in the promised land. And therefore, the meaning of being a family is not just a little nuclear element that can move wherever it pleases, but the original idea is you are a little vehicle of transmission of a way of life with a share in a land of a people which as a whole has been called to bear witness to and to carry on a way of life of holiness and righteousness, to be a mamlechet kohanim and a goy kadosh through the keeping of the covenant. And so land is not just free-floating real estate, and family is not just your druthers, but they are both somehow part of an overarching national cum familial mission, executed household by household. What to say about these things now? By the way, there's a wonderful short story that you and I discussed with Amy called Sorrow Acre by Isak Dinesen, which is an aristocratic novel, and in which the question of the obligation to provide heirs in relation to keeping up the relation to land and a way of life. Look, the question for modern times is, do we have a way of life? I don't mean we Jews, but we Americans, do we have a way of life that we're transmitting generation from generation? And do we have an attachment of place that and a growth of community that reinforces what we might teach household by household? It's thin. And while we're not going to readopt, I think, as Americans, and maybe even as American Jews, some of these customs, but there are questions about whether we care whether people disappear without a trace, and what it would mean to be our brother's keepers and not somehow celebrate as Cain would celebrate the disappearance of Abel. What difference does it make if Abel goes and has no progeny? There's a kind of deep teaching which, even if we don't practice, we should really regard as ingenious and humane. And the fact that it doesn't somehow fit our ideology of choice should somehow be a mirror in which we see the impoverishment of thinking everything has meaning only because we've chosen it.
Very interesting. You talk about the meaning of marriage as procreation. You have a nice passage where you talk about the procreation as the Jewish way of overcoming death, and you compare the Jews to the Egyptians. I wonder if you would talk about that now, so that we all get a chance to hear it. Your idea about how the Jewish way separates itself from the Egyptian way.
Look, the way of Israel already pointedly in Chumash is set off against the way of Egypt and against the way of the Canaanites. In Vayikra 18, which we read not too long ago, it begins the laws of forbidden unions. In a way, the centerpiece of the Jewish teaching on holiness begins with, you shall not follow the practices of the Egyptians behind and the Canaanites before. It's the summons to be holy. And it is all about the regulation of sexuality in the service of marriage, clear lines of lineage, and the care of children. You shall not sacrifice your children to Moloch. The Egyptians were obsessed with mortality, and they were trying to find some kind of cure for it. Through magic, through technology, through embalming, through the pyramids, the hope that the pharaohs at least might get eternal life. And the Canaanites were so little directed toward the procreative aspect of sexuality that this was a largely presentist, orgiastic culture of the sort you see erupting around the golden calf. It seems to me one group tries to use technology and administration to conquer mortality through magic, or in our day with the latter-day Egyptians, through immortality research and biology. The others deal with our mortality by eating, drinking, and whoring and being merry, for tomorrow we die. And the Jews deal with the problem of mortality by attaching themselves to an eternal God who teaches us that we have a share in the eternal by passing on the best way of life, that it too can become eternal. And we've been partners with Hashem in making that possible, not by looking for immortality for ourselves, but by teaching an immortal teaching to our children. The book of Ruth really just has it right there. Not the Moabites, where presumably, look, in the passage, honor your father and mother, which is the centerpiece of this and goes along with the teachings about sexuality, which are introduced. Every man revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths, for I am holy, right? You shall be holy. Honor your father and mother so that your days shall be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. I think the reading of that should be so that the land will not vomit you out the way it's going to vomit out the Canaanites and all of those nations, because their practices, sexual practices, are not reverential. There is no sacred distance in the household. Incest is all over the place. The book of Ruth is somehow the embodiment of the core teaching of the Jewish way with respect to generation, with respect to attachment to the land, and very important, one more thing. There is a deep Jewish teaching about the treatment of the stranger, and it's very subtle. On the one hand, you should tear down their pillars, and you shouldn't even have a meal with them lest the women seduce your sons and you'll go whoring after Baal and so on. Grave suspicion about the ways of the neighboring Canaanites. On the other hand, any stranger who finds himself in your midst is entitled to the full protection of the law, and even to Shabbat rest, including with everybody else. It's stunning that here we have a tale in which Chesed has been missing in the land in Bethlehem, and Chesed is not a monopoly of the Jews. Here it takes this stranger woman from a hated enemy nation whose Chesed sustains Naomi, whose Chesed inspires Boaz, whose Chesed somehow revives the community and gives rise to Israel's greatest king, whose psalms we still sing in praise of God to this day. Here's a place where you don't learn simply love of the other because other, but you learn that sometimes the redemption can come from strange places. And Israel here does itself proud by recognizing the chesed from this stranger, who in fact is their redemption. It's a stunning, stunning turn of events in this community.
Wonderful. So that's great. Thank you so much. So that this book must, as you've laid out the themes of it, it's absolutely essential for this book to end with a child, and it does.
Yep.
And the child is whose? Who takes the child at the end of the book?
It's quite marvelous. After the child is born, all of the women of Bethlehem have changed their tune. Naomi came back empty. Now they say a child is born to Naomi, and the villagers name him Oved, serving or servant. Naomi, by the way, hasn't said a word. She simply takes this new baby and holds the baby to her breast in a kind of gesture of adopting this child. And the women recognize this as a child, and the word ben could mean grandson. But the scene is Naomi has been somehow redeemed of her loss. This grandson is somehow a replacement for Machlon. And this child is named. And then we're told that Eved is the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. And the text finishes with the genealogy given to nobody. Nobody gets such a genealogy beyond Noach and Avraham, not even Moshe. So this is a very.
So we should not forget that Ruth was a Moabite. It's absolutely essential for this to be part of the story of David.
Look, what's quite marvelous, Boaz and Ruth are each of them descendants from forbidden unions, from abominable unions, father-daughter and father-daughter-in-law incests, things which Vayikra will make a big point of ruling out. But both of those women's were not indulging themselves for pleasure, but they were patrons of life when they thought life was no longer possible. And we will rule out their acts, but we will affirm their principle from within the covenant, and there can be redemption. History is not destiny. There can be tshuva and there can be redemption. And that's really what you see here in this marriage, which is not only redemptive for the participants, but look what they give rise to from these two infested lines. Through the acts of chesed, brought by Naomi, brought by Ruth, celebrated by Boaz, and consecrated with a child to Naomi. And out of this comes the Davidic
It's
line.
gorgeous. And it really, read in this way, you really can see how much is contained in this modest tale that it's wonderful. And I love the ending of your book, which is a surprising and very warm ending that you and Hannah put on the book. And I think appropriate for today, which is Mother's Day. And speaking as a Jewish mother, because we do take a lot of heat, just say that Naomi, as presented in your book, is across the centuries amazingly very recognizable as a Jewish mother. It's extraordinary considering the difference of time and place, how little has changed from Naomi to the Jewish mother of today, but only in the best sense, in that she is selflessly devoted to her children, to her daughter, and it's not even a son, it's a daughter and a daughter-in-law, and very, very much focused on the idea that this young woman needs to get married and have a baby. So it's, I won't give it away because I hope you'll all read this wonderful, wonderful book with an extraordinarily charming and surprising ending. So thank you so much.
Rachel, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Yes, likewise. Thank
for
you.
many years.
I appreciate it as well.
And a
Thank
happy
you,
Mother's
everyone.
Day to you
Thank
and
you.
to all my other friends on the Zoom. Many happy Mother Days to come.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Leon. Hag sameach.
Hag sameach.
Goodbye.